we looked at few things about backgrounds in previous sessions. We looked at four things, and then we looked at in detail how do we manage if backgrounds color change even after mentioning it in the prompts, right? So after this, we have few other things about backgrounds. Like apart from all those things, we have this as the list of what we need to understand in background. Now today we are gonna look at only this fifth part, that is the blur. So now we use blur as a concept in background a lot of times. Right? A lot of times we have to either blur the background or blur the characters to give it a impact or effect or a look, right? So we need to understand things about blur, but there are few things. Like blur is a very easy concept, but few of the things are some, like, I have noticed that people do mistakes in few things a lot. So let's try to look at those few things which are important and which you cannot miss. So we'll look at three major things that we need to make sure while you're blurring backgrounds or characters, or basically while you're using blur as a concept in making images. So first, uh, imagine that this is your image. So generally, we can blur any background. That's up to you if you want to blur the background or not. But if you are blurring the background, do not try to blur all the images of your episode. So first thing is, you should not, like, your episode should not look like the entire scene or the entire episode's background is blurred. It looks odd. It should be like, you have to give a sense of what the background is or how the background looks to the viewer. So you have to make sure that few images are in such a way where the user or reader is able to understand or look at the background. So very first thing is, you cannot blur the entire episode's background. You can definitely blur few of the backgrounds for sure. Sometimes we blur backgrounds if we don't want to work on the backgrounds. Like, let's say it's a complicated background and there are too many details in the background, and I don't want to, impaint each and every background or, do a lot of efforts on the background. So I can blur the background, few of the backgrounds. Second thing where I can blur the background is where sometimes I have to give a dramatic look to the images. So blurring the backgrounds make it look more dramatic. So yeah, I can blur the backgrounds. But again, I cannot blur all the background. I have to give a sense of what and how the background looks. Right. So first thing is, whenever you're blurring the background, right? Imagine that this is your image and I have to blur the background. So what I've seen people do is, there are two ways of blurring the background. One is either you use Studio to blur the background. So now what people do, if people use Studio to blur the background, is they'll have two sets of images. Like, let's say this as one image and they'll have one more image here. Now what they do is, they remove the background of the first image. So now they have an image without the background. And the second image that they had here, they will just blur the background out, like blur the complete image. And then they'll just put it here. So this is what people do. If they are, blurring the backgrounds in Studio, they'll just blur the entire image and then place the character on top. Or people also use Photoshop for blurring the background. Even in that case, what people do is, they will select this area. So I've seen people do this. So what they do is, they will select this area in Photoshop and then blur it. Now, in both these cases, like either you're doing blurring in Studio like this method, or you're using Photoshop to blur it, in both the cases, your image is gonna look like this. First of all, let me know if you understood this concept that how to blur images in Studio. Like anyone has a doubt in understanding how did I do this part, like remove background and then this. Anyone wants to know this, or should I assume that people know how to blur an image? Yeah, if no one is saying anything, I'll just assume that people know this. Fine. So now in both the cases, like even if you use Photoshop to blur it, like by selecting the region which you want to blur, or by using something like this of a method in Studio, your image is gonna look like this. Now, this is not a wrong image, and this is not a bad image. In the sense, I can use this image definitely. There's nothing wrong with the image. Like, I'm not saying this is a wrong image. But if I just zoom into this image, you can see this part, right? You can see this part of the image. This, like, kind of aura kind of image or something which looks glowy on the outside of the image or the outline of the image. It looks odd. It doesn't look bad, it doesn't look wrong. I mean, I can still go ahead and use this image, but sometimes, while making images like this, if I leave it like this, sometimes it looks odd. Instead of doing this, so what I suggest you guys to do is, whenever you have to blur a background, so instead of just blurring the background like this, like instead of just blurring the entire image background and then placing the character, what you can do is you can remove that character from your image. And then once you, like, let's say here I've used magic eraser. So I've just used magic eraser here and this is what I got. So I can just use this now. And now here I'll just blur this up. And I'll do the same thing. I'll just place this here. Let me just, yeah. So now, as you can see, I did the same thing in both the cases. Like I blurred the background image and then placed this image on top. But the only change is here I removed that character from the back. Here I did not. Just by doing that, you can see some difference here. Right? The edges of this image looks more clear. It looks more better. So if I look at the images, this looks much better than this. So visually, this gives a much better look. Like the images look-wise, it looks better, this one. So even if you do this in Photoshop, right? I'm not saying that don't use Photoshop for this. If you are using Studio, do this. Even if you are using Photoshop, then try to first, like, instead of directly selecting this part and blurring it, because even selecting this part, like if I just select this part in Photoshop and blur it, again, this will create a aura for, sorry, like it will create a lighting like this for this. It'll give me the same kind of results. So instead of directly blurring it, just ensure that you're removing that character from the back and then blurring the background, then patching, the character on top. So that will give you a much better look rather than making it look like this. Am I making sense here? People on the call. Yeah, okay. So now this is a very simple thing. We do blur a lot of images, but this one looks better than this. Okay. Now, second important thing about blurring is, so whenever we have a half cut image, so imagine that there's a half cut body, something like this, right? We can directly blur the background. There is nothing, we don't have to think too much about can I blur, how much blur. I don't have to really imagine those kind of stuff. I can just blur it very simply, just blur the background, patch the character on top. That's all I have to do, right? But when we talk about blurring full body shots, like when We talk about blurring an image in which the character is standing and I have the full body shot of the character. Then we have to understand that there are concepts in blurring. We cannot blur anything anywhere. Like we have to understand how to blur, where I cannot blur, and how much should the blur be. There are a lot of concepts here. So the very first thing that you have to understand, whenever you have a full body shot, don't directly blur the background. Like this is, how do I say? Lot of people do this mistake. I have seen lot of people do this. Whenever they have full body shot of the character, they will just exclude this character and they'll blur the rest of the part. Like this is what people do, and I have seen a lot of examples for this. So now you first understand this. You can never blur a image like this. Your image can never, like when I say never, I really mean never. Your image can never look like this. First thing is, understand this. When you have a character, let it be a character, let it be a, like let's say a box, a table, anything. This is not only for a character. Anything that is placed on a ground, right? And if that thing, that person is not blurred, that ground can also not be blurred. So if there is a character standing here and he is not blurred, so like his legs and shoes are not blurred, so this ground where he is standing or the ground where he is in contact, this can also not be blurred either. So there are two things here. Either if he is not blurred, right, so now he is in contact with the ground here, so this ground can also not be blurred. Or if the ground is blurred, he cannot be a non-blurry character. Like if the ground is blurred, even he will be blurred. This can never go like, if the character is in contact with the ground is blurred and the character is not blurred. Or if the character, let's say, it's not only about ground, it's about anything. If the character is holding something, sitting on a chair, anything, the chair can never be blurred, because if he is not blurred and he's touching that chair, the chair cannot be blurred. Or if the chair is blurred, he will also be blurred. So the very first thing here is, don't blur backgrounds when you have a full body shot. There are two kinds of mistake what people do. I've seen people do this a lot, like a lot. Second thing, what sometimes I've seen few of what people do is, if they have to blur something, like imagine if this is the image, right, and for some reason they have to blur this character because maybe you don't have to work on this or something. Like there are a lot of different things. Like imagine that this character is not sitting here, maybe he's standing here or something. So now they have to blur this character here or this character here. What they do is, without understanding what to blur, they'll just pick out this character and blur it. So like what they'll do is this, they'll just blur this part out. Half of the image is blurred, half of the image is not blurred. Like think about the image, something like this. I've already seen people do this. So half of the image randomly it will be blurred like this, and this will not be blurred. Or sometimes it's something like this. Like randomly this area of the image will be blurred because they might have to blur this character, or it might have to blur this character. So they'll just blur this part, only this much. This building is not blurred, this building is not blurred, this ground is not blurred, only this particular area is blurred. So let's understand this. Very first thing, don't never do this. Never blur. Okay, whenever a character is standing in a full body shot, don't blur the background. Especially don't blur the area where he is in contact with the background. Second thing, if you have to blur something, you have to understand blurring as a concept in 3D world does not work in one space. What do I mean by this is, let's try to understand this in detail. Let's try to understand what blur as a concept is, or how blur actually works in 3D space. So before going into that details, let me just tell you one small thing. So whenever we have a half shot like this, you never really have to worry about, can I blur or can I not? You definitely can. Because here, even though I know that the character is standing on the ground, it's not visible, on the screen right now. So even though she is standing on the ground, I can still blur the background without worrying about can I not blur the background. But when I can visibly see that the character is in contact with the ground here, then I cannot blur the background here. So in those cases, we have something called as depth blur in the concept. Now, what exactly depth blur is, let me try and show you by example. So whenever we have a full, not exactly full body shot, let's rephrase this. Whenever a character is in contact with you know the background. So now this can also mean that, imagine that this image right here, if she was something like this, like just imagine that her hands are here, like this is her hand and she's touching something, like let's say this is a wall or a door or anything, right? So she's now in contact with the door, or she's in contact with the wall, or she's in contact with the table, anything, whatever, this is something, right? So if now she's in contact with this, let's say this is a wall. Yeah, so now if she is touching that wall, I cannot blur this background. If like this, imagine if this character is, even though this is half cut image, but because she's not touching the wall, or she's, let's just say that she's touching something in the background, then I cannot blur the background, because then again it will be the same concept. If I blur this part, even the hands will be blurred, so her entire body should be blurred. Or if I am not blurring this hands out, I cannot blur this part, I cannot blur that wall. So it's not basically about full body shot or half body shot. It's basically about whenever the character that we are making is in contact with the background, don't blur the background. Your backgrounds, wherever it's in contact, it cannot be blurred. So now then we use something called as depth blur. Now this is what depth blur means. So now depth blur as a concept means that we blur the area which is not in contact, and slowly we start reducing that blur so that until it reaches the area where the character is touching that background, we are not blurring the background. So trying to explain this part. So let's say this is a ground, right? Now she is riding, or she is on a bicycle, and now that she's touching the bicycle and the bicycle is on the ground. So now definitely, if I cannot blur this part, I cannot blur this area, because if I do blur this ground, I'll have to blur this cycle as well. And if I blur the cycle, I'll have to blur her. So again, because she is touching this and now the cycle is touching the ground, I cannot blur this ground out. So now here, if I have to blur this image, I cannot randomly just, deselect this part and blur everything else, because this cycle is touching the ground. So now in that case, we use something called as depth blur. Now depth blur works in this way. So now this is an image. Now if you see, this area is blurred, right? Like blurred, too much blur. And then if you see, it's slowly, gradually, it will start decreasing the blur. And by the time it reaches this cycle wala part, there is no blur on the ground. So depth blur is nothing but wherever, if this is an image and there is a character standing here, let me redraw it. So if this is an image and a character is standing, something like this, just imagine. So now this area will be blurred, and because he's standing on the ground here, so this part will be blurred, but it will gradually start decreasing the blur, and by the time the blur will reach here, there will not be any blur. So that we also have blurred the background, but it's not like blurring the entire background. We cannot blur the entire background because this area I cannot blur, so I'll use depth blur here. So just to explain you more about depth blur, this is how depth blur works. Or just imagine this as your image. So because she is sitting on the bench, I cannot blur the bench, or I cannot blur this ground out. So what we'll use is we'll use depth blur. We can blur this part, definitely we can blur this part definitely, because there is a gap between the bench and this, but I cannot blur this part. So now we'll gradually decrease the blur here. Here there is more blur and it will gradually start decreasing. And by the time it reaches here, this part, there is no blur. Something like, let's say this. Now here there is too much blur and gradually the blur starts decreasing. Here there is no blur. Same thing like this. So depth blur, call it as depth blur or gradient blur. Same thing, right? It's something like you can blur, like it's something like focus. When you click a picture, right? When you focus something in your phone, or let's say camera, the background becomes blurry. But it just no, it can never be like the entire thing is blurry. It will gradually decrease the blur by the time it reaches the point where you're focused, right? So let me know if, first of all, you understood what exactly depth blur is or gradient blur is. Then we'll go on how to get this thing. But let me know if anyone has a doubt, first of all, in understanding what is the depth blur. Like, do any of you have any doubt in, or if you did not get this part and this part, that why this is not the right, like, way of blurring, and why this is the right way of blurring. Now let's understand few things about blur as a concept and try to understand how depth blur works. So imagine that this is a room, right? First, let me know if you guys can see a room. Anyone here on the call who feels like, where exactly is this room? I can only see few random lines here and there. Everyone can see a room here, a 3D room. Okay. So now let's just say that this is a room, right? So now if I have to blur the background, if I have to blur this room out, I cannot blur a room like this. Like I cannot randomly select one area of the room and blur it. Like this, imagine this is your room and I'm just blurring this part. I cannot blur one, plane of the room. Like the room is in 3D space, the 3D plane, right? So I cannot randomly just select only the ground and blur it and leave this as unblur. Or I cannot do, something like this, where I just leave the ground part and blur everything else. Now, a room is in 3D space, so blur also works in 3D space. Now, why I'm telling this is because this is something, again, what people do mistake is, like imagine someone has made this image, and if you put a comment saying, that the ground cannot be blurred because he's standing on the ground, what people do is they will just use something like this. They will do something like this. I've seen people do this. They will just unblur the ground part and leave the rest of the part blurred. Like a man is standing here and this floor is not blurred. Only the walls are blurred. So let's understand this. Blur does not work in this way. Blur always works in like the exact 3D space model. So if we have to blur something, if we have to blur a room, we cannot. So imagine that this is your room. This is how your room looks. So your room cannot be blurred like this. Like you cannot select one area of the room and just randomly blur it. Like, okay, if there is a man standing here, I have to blur it, so I'll just blur this part. It will not work in this way. Second thing, you cannot make the image like this, where you place a man here and just leave this part and blur the rest of the area. Again, this is something not how blur works. Blur always works in 3D space. So if I have to blur something, I have to blur it like completely. If I am blurring this part, let's just say, even this part, like the entire 3D space of that part will be blurred. Or just imagine that if I am blurring this part, only this part. Let's say this is not how blur works, but let's just say that I'm blurring this part. So only this area will not be blurred. It will be blurred like this. This entire area will be blurred. Something like this. It will always go in 3D. So first of all, blur cannot happen only in one plane. Whatever you are blurring, it should be in all the planes. Second thing, when we talk about depth blur, right, it cannot be like this. Like you cannot just blur one particular region, like you cannot select one particular region and just blur it in one, like let's say form. You have to understand when we talk about depth blur, it will be something like, the area which is far from us will be more blur and it will gradually start decreasing the blur. So imagine that the shade of the green that you can see here is the amount of blur you're doing on the background. So because here is a darker shade of green, there is more blur here. And gradually this blur will start decreasing. And the amount of blur here will be the amount of blur here, will be the amount of blur here, will be the amount of blur here. Or the amount of blur here will be same in all these walls. It will never be like that this wall has this amount of blur and then suddenly the blur will increase here, decrease here. This line will always follow the same amount of blur. So whatever blur you are doing on this wall, the same thing will happen in all the walls, in particular that area. So let me know if this is like clear, I'm making sense here. Anyone has any doubt in understanding this one? Because this is important and this is hard for me to explain. But let me know if anyone has a doubt here. Okay. So, yeah, we cannot select one region of the background and blur that with one intensity first thing. We'll have to gradually decrease the blur so that it looks like a depth blur. It cannot look like this, rather it should look like this. Second thing, we cannot just select one plane of the room and blur it. It will never be like the ground is blurred or the ground is not blurred. Either the entire thing is blurred or nothing is blurred. So one example is something like this. So your room, rather than your room looking like this or this or this, your room should look like this. If you see the ground, you'll be clear. If you see this, you'll understand that here you're able to see the blur part and you can see gradually the blur starts decreasing. Here there is no blur, here there is blur, and in between this you can't make out that where exactly the blur ends. It gradually ends somewhere here, but your blur cannot look like this. Like your blur should not look like this. Something like this. That I can just see that the blur ends here. So your room should not look like this. Rather, it should look like this. If this is how the room looks, yeah, if this is how our room is, this is how blur happens in the room. So now if imagine that this is the same room and I'm doing the same blur. Okay, also one more thing. Now this blur can also go in like the vice versa form. What I mean by this is not always it can also go like this. So now here what we have done is this is more blur, right? The part which is far from the camera. Now imagine the camera is somewhere here, right? Imagine the camera is placed here. So now because this is like far from the camera, this is more blur and gradually it starts decreasing, but it can also go like this. Like this is more blurred and this is less blurred. It can also go like this. It depends on what you are focusing. If my focus is here near the camera part, this will be more blurred. If my focus is on, like, let's say this, imagine this. If my focus is on this door, then this will be clearer and this will be more blur. So again, this is not like a fixed way of blurring that it will always be like this will be more blurred and this will be less blurred. It can go like more here and less here. It will depending on what you are focusing on or how exactly do you want to make the image look. Like imagine that there is a person standing here and you are making a over the shoulder shot. So now you're focusing on this person and you want this person, like, let me explain this. So imagine that there is a person standing here and it's over the shoulder shot of a different person. Now, if you want to focus on this person, this will not be blurred and this will be blurred. So maybe you'll blur it like this. More blur here, less blur here. So again, this concept of where to blur depends on your image or your understanding of how do you want to blur it, and how much you want to blur, that depends on, again, you'll understand how much to blur, but this is how your blur works, right? Now, if this is a room, let's say this is a room, right? So whatever is placed, now let's assume this part of a room, like let's just take this part. So between this region, right, whatever I'm marking right now. So in between this region, whatever I keep, right, let me just, yeah. So now if there is a man standing here, this is the amount of blur happening in this region, right? Now if there is a man standing between this region, he will, sorry, he will also be blurred in the same amount of blur that is happening here. So if let's just number it, right? Just to understand. Now this is like 10% blur. Let's just say, right? This is maybe 8% blur. This is maybe 6%. This is maybe 4%. This is maybe 2%. Let's just assume that this is how blur is, right? So if now there is 6% blur here happening in this region, in this entire region. So if there is a man standing here, he will also be blurred in 6% only. It cannot happen that the person is not blurred or the person is blurred more. It will be the same amount of blur. If this is 6%, he will also be in 6%. If now imagine this region, right? If this is like 8% blur here, and there is a man standing here, or imagine that there is a table here, or a chair here, or anything. There's simply a box kept here, right? So now this box will also be blurred at 8% only. It cannot be like this background is blurred 8%, but the box is unblurred, or the box is blurred as 20%. The amount of blur we have here, it will be the same amount of blur here. So two things here, whenever we use depth blur as a concept and we are gradually increasing or decreasing the blur, whatever things or characters are placed on the ground, they will also have the same amount of blur that the ground has. To explain this here, let's assume this image. So now this is again same image, right? We can see that there is more blur here. So now let's just mark this. Now imagine that this is 10% blur. Now here it's maybe 5% blur. And here on the, I'm just marking the ground, right? If you see the ground, this is like more blur, this is like less blur. And here you can see there is no blur. It's like no blur here. So maybe let's just say it's 0% blur, right? So now here, if this is how the ground looks, if this is how my entire room is, like maybe this is like 10% blur here in the wall, this is like 5% blur, this is like 0% blur. If this is how the room is, whatever character or things that are placed here, it will also be blurred in the same way. If there is a man standing here, he will also be blurred 10% blur. If there is a man standing here, it will be 5% blur. If there's a man standing here, it will be 0% blur. Or imagine this, the door is more blurred and the sofa is less blurred. right? So um this more blur and less blur does not only work on grounds or walls, it will also follow, or this concept of blur will also follow for the characters or things that are placed here. So whatever amount of blur you have for the background, that should follow for your characters as well, wherever they are standing, depending on your room. Like, is this making sense, or am I making this more confusing? Okay, I'm assuming this is making sense.
Yes, yes, it is making sense.
Okay, perfect. So now, same thing here, the thing that we just covered. So if there is a man standing here and there are people standing here, then more blurred. So the people here will be more blurred, and because he is standing here and there's less blur, he will be less blurred, right? Same thing here. You can see that this background is blurred, right? I can see that this area is blurred, but this door is not blurred, or this frame of this door is also not blurred. Like this is not blurred, this is not blurred, but this is blurred. The reason is again the same thing. Now if I don't have this, like imagine this image as something like this. So if this image looks like this, I don't have to worry about. I can just make this background blurred and then place him like this. But if he is in contact with something, if he is holding this door, right, I cannot blur this door. The reason is because he is touching the door. Like I can see him touching the door, right? So I can blur this part, I can show that this part is blurred. But even though this is a half cut image, this door will not be blurred. Or if I blur it again, I have to do the, like, the grading of the blur. I can see that there is a blur here, like this part I can see that there is a blur, but there is no blur here. So I'll gradually make the blur like this. More blur here, less blur here. But this part, wherever he's touching that door, this cannot be blurred. So we have to understand when we can blur, where we cannot blur, and what are the different ways of blurring when we have a image. Like, one image can be blurred in different ways. So how much blur can I do? Or what concept of blur I can use? Can I simply blur it? Can I, not do that? Do I have to use depth blur? Where can I do depth blur? Where I cannot? And how much to do, and how much not to do? All these things we have to understand before, blurring the image. So, assuming that there is no doubt till this point, let me know if starting from here till this point, if there is any doubt, then we'll move forward. Yeah. I'll assume there is no doubt here. So now let's understand how to use depth blur, because we do have blur as a concept in Studio. Like I can blur the entire image definitely, but I cannot do depth blur here or gradient blur. So let me just give you a quick explanation on how you can do depth blur as a concept, right? Or how you can use depth blur. Now, I'll try to explain depth blur, but even though if you don't have Photoshop, you can still do that. So there are three different ways by which you can do depth blur here. Now, one way is people who are using Photoshop right now, and you are using the current latest version of Photoshop, you can directly, like imagine that this is my image and I have to use depth blur here. So you can directly go into neural filters and you'll find an option called depth blur here. So you can directly use depth blur. Now you have a lot of things to play around here. In depth blur, you can play with focus subject or not. When you have focus subject, how much strength do you want to keep? What should be your focal range? All these things you can play around. And if you can see, this was our original image. Let me just try to show you what it did. So this is how the original image looked like. If you can see, there is no blur here, but now we have a blur at the back. And if you see here, yeah, so if you see here, you can see that there is a blur here. Okay, so there is a blur here, over here. There is a blur. You can see, okay, you can see this particular line. You can see that there is more blur here and there is no blur here. And there is less blur over here. And because he's standing on this ground, I can see that this ground has blur here, but it gradually decreases till this point. So you can see it making the depth blur very easily. Right? So people who are using Photoshop, directly one step to using depth blur. Okay, people who are not using latest version of Photoshop, or maybe you're not using Photoshop at all, you still can do depth blur here. You can use gradient blur as a concept. So if I have to, use gradient blur here, I can just do something like this. So let me just, okay. So we have, okay. So now we have both the things on different layers, right? I have one image with only the ground here. Sorry, only the background. Okay, 1 minute. I have to remove this, right? Blur. Yeah. So now let's say this is my image, right? Now the very first thing is whenever we are blurring, I cannot select this like this. Like I cannot blur this part, right? Because again, if I blur it directly like this, it will again create something like this. It'll give me a shadow around that person, like character, something like this. It'll create something like this, which I don't want. So what I'll do is I'll just remove that. I'll just keep my character with me separately, and I'll just remove that person from my background. Now there can be other ways of doing this as well, like using gradient blur or stuff. You might know. If you don't know how to do it, then you can look at it. So now I just have to gradient blur it, right? So I can just first blur this up. Because if I use Gaussian blur, it will just blur the entire thing, right? So I'll just use mask. And now let me just blur it. So now I have here, you can see here, there is a blur here, there's no blur here. Now I can just change it. Depending on how much or where do I need this blur. Let me keep it like this. Okay. And now because I have the character here, let me just remove that leg. Yeah, you can see that the gradient blur is again here. You can see that the blur is here, less blur here, and you can see it gradually no blur till this point. And now because we already have this character with us placed, now we can just place it. So now this is how you can do. If you don't have this option, then you can do this. Now if someone cannot do either of this, I'll tell you a very simple step of doing gradient blur. But this is not a very effective way of doing gradient blur. Like, I'll not suggest you to do this method or use this method a lot, but for few cases, yeah, it will work. So now imagine that you don't have Photoshop, or you're not sure how to do gradient blur or something. There is one simple way, but not a very effective way. So what you can do is you can have two different layers here. The upper layer, you can just Gaussian blur it like this, and then you can remove the blur wherever you want. So before that, we will need this character. Okay, so let me just got stuck. Okay, let's wait for this to. Okay. By the time this is happening, let me know if you have any doubt in the rest of the two methods. Okay. So now we have something like this. Now this is like, you can see, because this is like Gaussian blurred, the entire image is blurred. So now you can use your eraser and erase off areas. So now, because we have like a layer here at the back which is not blurred, like this layer is like completely non-blurred image, and this like completely blurred image on top, I can just remove few areas here and there. I can gradually decrease the opacity to give it again a bit of a look of that gradient blur look. That this is like more blur, lesser blur. So you can manually as well do this, but again, not a very effective way of making blurs, but it can be used if you have none of the tools. So I just showed you three different ways of doing the gradient blur or the depth blur. Either you can just select the image and go to this neural filters and you'll have an option of depth blur. If not that, again, you can use Gaussian blur and then put a gradient on top of it. Or if you don't have this option as well, then you can manually erase off that area and make it like a gradient blur effect. All the three ways work, but let me know if there's a doubt here in understanding any of the ways. We can have more ways. We can definitely have more ways than this. I, as of now, know these three different ways. We are almost done. We are left with only one concept of blurring here. Okay, so this is important. Now, when we have different objects or different characters in a 3D space, imagine the same thing, right? If we have like three characters here, and we have to show that the three characters are standing apart from each other. Like, let's just say that these three characters are standing apart, right? Like, he's standing away from this character and he's standing very far from this character. So there is a gap between these three characters, right? There should be a depth between these three characters. While looking at the image, I should be able to judge that there is a gap between the three characters. So when you are, like, let's say, let's take this as an example. Now, whenever we make an over the shoulder kind of images where we have to show that, a person is standing and one of them is like in a back pose, and we blur this image, right? So there is nothing wrong in blurring the image, but you have to understand what people do is they will blur this background, like the background here. They will blur this character, like the same amount of blur here and the same amount of blur here. So now what happens by this is, imagine that this is the room. So imagine that this is how the room looks. Let's not make this, let's keep it like this. Yeah. So now this is how the room looks. Now this is the person here in black. This is the person in black, and this is the person in maroon, let's say. So here is that person standing. This is that person, right? So now you can see that there is a gap between all the three of them. Like this is the wall, this is the background wall. Now he is standing away from that wall. Like he's not stuck to the wall, right? He is standing away from that wall. There is a gap between this person and the wall. Now there is a gap between this person and the wall. So we have three characters standing at three different points. So if this is my top view of the room, this is the wall. This is character with black t-shirt. And maybe this is the character with maroon t-shirt. So now there is a gap between all three of these things. Like the wall, the person with black t-shirt, the person with maroon t-shirt. All three of them have a depth or like a gap between each other. So while making that blur, I have to understand that I cannot blur it in the same amount. Something similar to like this. If this is like far away, it will be more, this will be less. Or this will be less and this will be more. But they cannot have same blur. Like this person, and this person can never have same amount of blur. Either this will have more blur or this will have less blur, or this will have less blur and this will have more blur. But they cannot have same amount of blur because they are standing apart from each other. Like something similar to like this. He and he cannot have same amount of blur because they are away from each other. Now, if a person is standing here, like exactly here, same person, now they can have same amount of blur, but they will not have same amount of blur. So whenever we are making images like these, and we are blurring the background as well, and we are also blurring the character that is in the back pose, we cannot give this blur and this blur the same amount. Like this blur and this blur cannot be same. Either this person will have more amount of blur and the background will be less blur, or the background will be more blur and the character will be less blur. Like I should be able to see the depth between these two things. By looking at the image, you should be able to understand that there is a depth. Now here in this image, for some reason this image looks like this character and this background is merging. Like if I don't look at this part of my image, if I don't look at this part, I'm not able to understand how far is he from this wall. It just looks like he's very close to the wall, but actually he's not. Like the wall and this person are way apart from each other because there is a person standing in between these two things. So instead of making, now you can blur this as well, you can blur this as well. Definitely it can happen when we focus on this person, but it cannot be same blur. You'll have to understand that your blur can look like this. Now if you see here, again you can see that this background is again blurred, but this background blur is very low here and this person's blur is very high. Again, both of them are blurred. Like this person is not blurred, the background is blurred, this person is blurred, but this blur is more, this blur is less. And because of this thing, right, let me just remove all this thing. Just because of this less and more blur, you can see the difference, or you can understand the depth between these two things. So now if you look at, compare the two images, you can understand the difference. Yeah, so it can also go in a different way. Like the background can be more blurred and the character in the back can have less blur. Definitely this can also be one way, but just I'm not explaining that, I'm just explaining that whenever we have 3 or 4 different parts of the images and they have a gap between them, we have to understand the depth can never be same, or the blur can never be same. We have to blur it in a way where it makes sense that this person is away from that person or that wall or whatever thing is there. So blurring also shows that depth. The amount of blur explains us how far or close that person is. So yeah, to again explain this one point, you can see few examples here. If you see, so now again, comic is something similar to what we see in movies or whatever we have from camera, like the images that we captured from camera. So we have to understand, if you see now, this is again over the shoulder shot. There are three different, views here. But if you see, I can understand that, see, this character and this character, and there's a wall, right? So now there are three different parts of the image, but I can clearly understand that these three parts of the image have a depth between them. They are not merging together. Like this is blurred, he is not blurred, he is again blurred, but the amount of blur he has and the amount of blur this wall has a different has a difference, which indicates that there is a difference of like where exactly these are placed on a 3D space. So, same thing here. If you see that this background is blurred, again this person is blurred. But if you see this part, right, you're able to understand that these two are not merging together. You're able to understand that this flower is kept away from this person, because if, just think about it, if you blur this flower the same amount of blur you have for this guy, it will give me a feel that maybe this guy is holding that flower, but actually in actual case it's not. The flower is kept on the ground somewhere away from this character, and we can understand by this, because even the flower is blurred and even the guy is blurred, but the amount of blur they have here has a difference in them, which indicates or shows us that they both have a difference, or they are apart from each other. We did understand three concepts about blurring. First one was, whenever you have a half cut image or a half body image where you have to just blur the background, don't blur the background like this. Rather, just remove the character so that you get a crisp image, you get a neat image there. Second thing, we learned about depth blur. So whenever we have an image with full body shot of image, you cannot blur the background. You cannot just blur the background, because wherever the character is in contact with the background, you cannot blur that part. So there comes a concept of depth blur, where we blur the area that is not in contact and gradually decrease that blur. So we looked at few examples, then we understood how exactly blur as a concept work in 3D space. So in a 3D space, the blur cannot happen only in one region or part of the image, like one selected region or one plane of your image. It has to go in 3D space and gradually increase or decrease. So we looked at something like this, where we understood how blur works in more and less, how exactly blur looks when it works on a 3D space. Then we understood that the amount of blur that we have on the background is the same amount of blur that should happen on the characters or whatever is placed on the image. So if the area of the background is blurred more, whoever is standing close to that area will be blurred more. If the person is standing somewhere or in the room where it's very low blur, the character will also have a very less amount of blur. So something similar to like this, where we have like three different characters standing at three different places, and the amount of blur that we had on the character depends on the amount of blur we have on the room, right? And then same thing, the character, if character is in contact with the background, that background part cannot be blurred. And then we looked at how when we have different characters standing at different places of the room and there are gap between those things, the amount of blur explains us that there is a gap between them. If we do the same amount of blur for the background character and the character who is standing very close to the camera, it will not give us a depth feeling. So to give or get that depth feeling, we'll have to either blur the character which is near to the camera more, or maybe the amount of blur will be less. But it'll be like, if this is less, this will be more. If this is less, this will be more. So it should be something like the camera view. If this is my camera, if imagine this is my camera, so if this is the person very close to me and I'm focusing on this, my focus of the camera is on this person, so definitely this person is not blurred. So I'll have to blur the wall and I have to blur this character. So now, because these have a gap between them, either this person, because he's closer to the camera, he'll be blurred more and this will be blurred less. But it can also be in a different way where this is more and this is less, but the amount of blur cannot be same, because the same, if we have same amount of blur, it will look like it's merging together, which we don't want. We have to give it a feel where it looks like they are not merging together, which is a very good example here, which explains us why blurring, amount of blur is important.